The 3-inch gun carrier is one of the best tank destroyers that low-tier Britain has to offer. Well armoured, with a powerful gun, and so square it puts Tiger 1s to shame. If you've just picked the British tech tree up, and you're wondering what to bring for your rank 2 lineup, or if you watched my video about British 3.0 and wanted to learn the lore behind this strange square stug, this is just the video for you. I've divided this guide into 5 chapters. There will be timestamps for each one, so if you want to skip to a particular topic, use them to find what you need. Part 1. History. The origins of the gun carrier are in a 1941 General Staff request for a tank with a large caliber, high velocity gun. Not unlike the German Stug 3 introduced a year earlier, which had proven very successful and economical compared to turreted designs. The chassis of the Churchill infantry tank was chosen to mount a fixed 76mm, or, as they would have put it at the time, 3-inch anti-aircraft gun in an armoured casemate, giving much improved firepower and protection over the contemporary Churchill 2s with their 40mm 2-pounder guns in turrets. The gun itself was long obsolete. It was converted from the QF, that's quick firing, 3-inch stationary and ship-based anti-aircraft cannon, which was itself based on a pre-World War I Vickers design. The chassis of the Churchill was largely unmodified, aside from being up-armoured with an 88mm or 3.5-inch thick casemate, and having the hull machine gun removed. The simplicity of the design meant that by early 1942, 50 prototypes had already been built and were ready for testing. Performance seemed satisfactory, but the obsolete 3-inch gun would prove one of the main drawbacks of the gun carrier. By the time the prototypes were being built, the much more advanced 76mm 17-pounder was already well into its development as a dedicated anti-tank gun, and by late 1943, many vehicles were starting to mount it, such as the Challenger, the Archer SPG, and the legendary Sherman Firefly. With such a capable gun already under mass production, the decision was made to cancel the order for gun carriers. The 50 prototypes never saw combat. A few examples, ex-firing range, exist in the UK, but none in a complete state. Part 2. Strengths and Weaknesses. In War Thunder, the gun carrier is a typical British vehicle. It has a mix of very good characteristics, its armour and its large main gun, and crippling drawbacks, its slow speed, lack of any machine guns or secondary armament, and non-existent reverse gear. Like most casemates with fixed guns, it excels in medium to long range engagements, where it doesn't have to manoeuvre too much, and suffers at close range, where it can be flanked and destroyed from the rear. It also struggles in full up tiers, where better guns all round render its armour more of a drawback than a positive, although this is a weakness shared by all heavy tanks. The gun depression is another flaw. Although you get a decent 10 degrees of theoretical gun depression, using the Churchill chassis to peek over ridges is very risky, owing to the casemate mounting and sluggish movement speed. This means you should try to stick to level ground. It's where the gun carrier works best. The really great thing about the gun carrier is the aforementioned gun. It can go clean through the front of even some 4.0 heavy tanks, like the KV-1s and later Panzer IVs. Although, as the shot lacks explosive filler, you'll need to aim to disable enemy tanks so they can't fire back. This means, in practical terms, if you can bring the gun to bear on an enemy, you can score a kill every time. Obviously there are moments where you'll just get unlucky and bounce off a T-34 mantlet, but most of the time, a hit with the 3-inch gun will do a good amount of damage. The only poor thing I have to say is that you'll have trouble with light vehicles. If you don't damage anything important, the round will simply pass straight through thin armour, and the lack of a secondary machine gun to quickly take out fast, open-top vehicles makes them a good counter to the gun carrier. As for armour, the gun carrier is excellent in this area as well. The 89mm on the upper front plate allow it to shrug off AP rounds from most smaller guns, and it's mostly other tank destroyers with larger guns or howitzers that you'll have to fear. Your best skill in this is angling. When the tank is angled at 45 degrees to an enemy, the effective armour thickness goes from 89 to 120mm at the front, and some 100 odd millimeters on the frontal side plates. Using angling, it's possible to survive hits from larger guns and allow yourself to get a shot in, but you shouldn't count on it to save you from dedicated tank destroyers like Dickermaxes or Chi-Ha long guns. In summary, the strengths are great frontal armour and a powerful gun. Even in full up tiers, your gun is very capable. Weaknesses are slow speed and a lack of secondary armament. You'll really feel the lack of a machine gun at this BR. Part 3. Recommended Playstyle. The gun carrier is best played at medium to long range. As a slow casemate vehicle without any commander MG to save you from flanking enemies, close range fighting is very dangerous. On wide open maps, this is fairly easy. The gun carrier excels over long sightlines where its armour is more effective and its slow gun traverse is minimised, but many maps are smaller, more close range, often urban in this BR range. When using the gun carrier in these maps, try to stay either on the front line with teammates or slightly further behind them to reduce the chances of being flanked and attacked from the sides or rear. Your turn rate isn't bad, but you stand no chance of winning a close quarters fight where someone's behind you. You can use your superior gun and armour to fend off light and medium tanks. Just remember to angle. Most guns can still go right through your front plate if you're not angled.
Plus you killed a child.
The best way to brawl in the gun carrier is to angle at 45 degrees to an opponent, wiggling occasionally so they can't shoot your barrel as easily, then waiting for them to fire and deflect off your armour. Then, while they're reloading, return fire. If the enemy tank starts approaching you, make sure to keep a distance. The closer you are, the harder it will be for you to turn your tank, and if they flank you, it's all over. A general tip that applies to most British tanks around this BR: your reverse gear is awful, and you shouldn't rely on it. Even in this heavily armoured tank destroyer, don't peek around any terrain unless you're sure you'll be safe doing so, because you can't reverse back into safety as quickly as you came out. And one more tip: the more opponents you're fighting, the harder it is to get a good angle. Unless you're in a full down tier, try to only engage one enemy at a time. It's possible to survive a fight with multiple weaker foes, but much harder due to your lack of a turret. One more point about modules and the stock grind. After unlocking parts and FPE, you should focus on mobility modules like tracks and engine, since there are no improved shells to get and your stock gun handling is already pretty good. In summary, the best overall playstyle is to stay behind the front line, keep the front towards your enemy, and engage targets of opportunity. You shouldn't expect to flank in the gun carrier, instead relying on your good armour and cannon to deal with individual targets. And don't forget to angle your armour. Part 4. Weak spots and counterplay. Now I'll discuss some notable weak spots in the armour, as well as recommending ways to effectively counter the gun carrier. Overall, the 89mm frontal armour is very reliable against most rounds. There are no glaring weak spots, because you lack an MG port, and it's only the rare Swedish APDS or stray heat shell that will give it any trouble. Large caliber guns, like the later German 75s, can penetrate the front if unangled, but once angled, the front plate becomes nearly invulnerable in practical terms. The armour on the lower front plate is heavily sloped but very thin, so Soviet rounds can pass through it occasionally. It also benefits from angling, so that's even more incentive to angle when taking fire. The armour on the sides of the gun carrier is very good towards the front. Two 36mm thick plates overlap to give great protection against most rounds. There is a weak spot further back though, where the armour is only one plate thick, meaning APHE shells can easily score some crew kills if they hit here. This is actually a huge downside when angling, as the further you angle, the more of it you expose. But since most opponents won't know about this weak spot, you shouldn't get one shot here too often. The rear of the gun carrier is where the armour is thinnest, a mere 25mm plate, which all but the smallest guns can easily penetrate. If a vehicle gets behind you in the gun carrier, this is the most easily exploitable weak spot, and probably means you've just earned a ticket back to the hangar. The roof is also extremely thin, at just 16mm. If an enemy manages to get a high explosive shell up there, it's usually game over. You can, if you're unlucky, also take damage from planes making strafing runs, as you're a big and obvious target, and sometimes shells will get through. Overall though, the biggest weak spot isn't the armour, it's the mobility. The neutral steering is fast and responsive, but the abysmal reverse speed of 3 km an hour means you can't maintain separation from fast opponents, or quickly duck back into cover after exposing yourself. This leads me neatly into how to play against the gun carrier. You should exploit its poor mobility and flank around it. Once you're within 200 meters of this tank, it's much easier to avoid shots, as your opponent will have to maneuver their whole tank to aim at you. Light vehicles like the German Puma or the Soviet BT series of tanks can use their small size and high speed to evade fire from the gun carrier, then get round to the sides and rear where the armour is weak and make an attack. If you see a gun carrier at distance, try not to peek out at it unless you're absolutely certain you can penetrate it. German 75mm guns will usually manage, but Soviet and American guns really struggle at range. In summary, the gun carrier's armour is fantastic on the front and forward sides, but has some crippling weak spots towards the rear of the vehicle and on the roof. If fighting one, don't waste your time trying to hit weak spots from the front. Flank around or shoot out the tracks so you can get in close and hit the weaker armour at the rear. Part 5. Conclusion. In closing, this is a great tank destroyer, and one of the British tech tree's only true heavy tanks which can reliably make use of its armour. It definitely has a place in any British 3.0 lineup, and you can take it to 3.3 and still make good use of it. In down tiers, the armour will protect you from most tanks, and in up tiers, the great main gun will still go straight through most opponents without trouble. It's fairly easy to use, and the stock grind isn't too bad, so obviously, pick it up. You'll have fun. Thanks for watching, everyone. Links to my historical sources are in the description. If this has piqued your interest, go and watch my British 3.0 montage, in which I use the gun carrier to full effect. See you in the next one.